The children of the three families of the Helios Empire were born from generation to generation with special abilities. The El family had abilities related to the knowledge of the world. It was destroyed by the Aravos family, who were renowned for their outstanding skills in swordsmanship and martial arts. And the last family, Leroy, was known for having abilities in a wide variety of fields. However, Letitia, the eldest daughter of the Leroy family, was like a stranger and couldn't awaken a single ability. She wasn't beautiful, but she wasn't ugly either. Not tall, but not short either. There was nothing special about her, she was just cute. Blue-eyed with pink hair. She wasn't as beautiful as Diana, a stern and proud beauty with coral hair, and certainly not as clever as Emil. He was particularly studious and eager to learn, and not at all skilled with a sword unlike Xavier, who was a courageous and tough warrior. She was not as talented in magic as the youngest of the Leroy children, Irene, but Letitia had never been jealous of her siblings' abilities. On the contrary, she was proud of them, so it was a blow to her to learn that the whole family was ashamed of her existence. When they decided to abandon Letitia by telling her that she, Letitia Leroy, was being banished from the house of the Marquis de Leroy. And the most hurtful thing was that her father had said it. Her father had said angrily that from that day on, she was no longer his daughter, and that she should never dream of returning to the family castle. They slammed the door in her face, leaving her alone. In the end, her family just left her homeless and destitute. Bitter tears of resentment and misunderstanding rolled down her cheeks. She did not know what to do and where to go. She didn't know what to do, where to go, who to ask for protection, comfort, and most importantly, support. Letitia remained outside the castle walls in the dark night. She looked ahead. Before her stood a knight in iron armor, emotionless and cold like those people called her family. She remembered where it all began. It was a ball. Someone exclaimed, "Oh my goodness, it was the Leroy family. They were gorgeous. Xavier, Emil, Diana, and Irene." There was a whisper as they entered the hall. There were glances at them. Someone said that he had heard that they all had excellent abilities, but there was a whisper that she, Letitia, was the only one among them who had not awakened any abilities so far. Someone else asked, that wasn't that strange? It was a challenge for Letitia, but she decided to ignore the gossip. It wasn't her fault. Her father sadly thought more and more often that it was as if she was not their daughter. My mother heard him say that luckily they had other children anyway. Their words hurt Letitia. She felt superfluous and could not realize that without special abilities, she did not deserve their love. But her father asked again, she really didn't have any powers, and added that even something useless would do. But Letitia bowed her head guiltily and quietly asked for forgiveness. But the Marquis de Leroy was even more infuriated by this, and angrily shouted that could she at least stop apologizing. And his mother came up to him and asked him to calm down. But he closed his eyes tiredly, and said that it was because he was upset whenever he saw her, and he added that Letitia was a disappointment. But his mother asked him to be patient for a while, if only for the sake of tomorrow. Letitia looked at them and realized that they didn't care how she felt. No one supported her, reassured her, or comforted her. Her father selfishly said again that their second daughter's birthday was coming up and he should hold back. Their indifference made the girls heartbreak. They cared about their second daughter's birthday, and she was not important to them. She squeezed the fabric of her skirt with her hand. The parents cared about how perfectly prepared the party was. So Mum went with Father to check on the last preparations. Letitia was alone in the room. Her birthday had passed, and yet, she remembered. When she was still a toddler, joyfully ran up to her father saying her birthday was coming up, hoping for a celebration. That her father sternly and irritably pronounced that she was no longer a child but still cared about her birthday. She bowed her head sadly and thought that the birthday celebration, it was all her fault. If she had the same awakened abilities as everyone else, her parents wouldn't hate her, wouldn't be so upset, and her younger siblings wouldn't ignore her. Diana was particularly arrogant, a beautiful, cold beauty. Letitia again came to the conclusion that it was her fault. There was nothing she could do about it. She didn't have the ability, and without abilities, her family didn't need her. Suddenly, a red slipper appeared in front of her downcast gaze. She was so preoccupied that she did not hear her sister approaching. She looked up at her and looked at the flawless and coldly superior Diana. She threw in irritably that maybe Letitia would step aside, and contemptuously asked what did she even know that stood in her way. Letitia depressedly asked to be excused and added quietly that she did not mean to. Diana gave her a disdainful glance and walked past her, throwing her on the way. How long was she going to embarrass them? She didn't fail to jab Letitia that she was the only one in their family who had never awakened. Amidst all the other children, there were rumors about her that she was an illegitimate child, a mutant, or a cursed child. From each of the family members, she felt reproachful looks and judgment. They seemed to be saying that at least she knew how much they were embarrassed by her incompetence. Diana glared angrily at her older sister, and then she asked, angrily poking her in the chest with her finger, "Are you sure she doesn't have any powers?" Letitia annoyedly tried to say something, but her sister impatiently mouthed for her to move and get out of her way. She turned and threw after Letitia that what a wretched thing she was. She went to her room so as not to disturb anyone else, and there in silence she could indulge in her sad thoughts. There was a knock on the door. When she said that she could come in, a maid appeared on the doorstep with a cart full of food. She smilingly turned to Letitia and said that she had made her favorite tea. But Letitia lay on the bed turning away from Mary and pronounced that she shouldn't have bothered. She was going to bed early. Mary looked at the young girl carefully and asked, "Is something wrong?" Tears stood in the girl's eyes, but she kept silent. She remembered her father's hurtful words and her mother's indifference and the neglect of her brothers and sisters. She asked, turning to Mary, "Why doesn't she have powers?" And then she added that Diana, Xavier, Emile, and even little Irene had them. So why was she the only one who didn't have them? She had always thought about it. Why is she the only one who doesn't have any talents? Why is she the only one who is so weird? And she remembered again how her little sister had called her wretched, and she told Mary that Diana had called her wretched. Letitia squeezed the fabric of the pillow with her hand and thought bitterly that this was all happening because she didn't have any powers like they did. But Mary said with tenderness and care in her voice that maybe she had them. She just couldn't see it yet. Her encouragement cheered Letitia up a little, and she sat up on the bed and looked at Mary and asked how her brother was doing. Mary was touched by the young lady's concern. The thought of her brother made her a little sad, for he was neither getting worse nor better. And she added that the doctor said she should try another medicine, but it was too expensive. Letitia pulled out all her jewelry and suggested that Mary take it all to buy the medicine she needed for her brother, adding that she didn't need it anyway. Such an act stunned the maid. She waved her hands in protest and added fearfully that the Marquis would be very angry if he knew about it. But Letitia endeavored to assure her that everything was all right. She endeavored to put a string of pearls into her hands, and Mary thanked her for her care and absently refused, and modestly added that she had enough to worry about her and her brother. And then she suddenly cheered up and said that she wished money would fall from the sky, and then she would take it for herself. Her positive mood was transferred to Letitia, and she smilingly said that she would be quicker to collect money on the street. Dusk had already descended on the street, and the street lamps were lit. Letitia looked out of the window and said she had better hurry up and leave before it got dark. Even though Mary said she had a little more time, Letitia insisted that she go home anyway, adding that she was worried about her brother. And then Mary thanked Letitia for her kindness and said that she would go then. But already on the threshold of the room, Letitia had called out to her and wished earnestly that she hoped Mary would find the money in the street. Mary smiled and covered her mouth with her hand and said that lady was so nice and promised that she would collect all the money. When Mary left the castle for the street, she looked at Letitia's windows and there was no longer a light on. Mary thought sadly of her poor lady. She is so kind, but because she has no magical powers, she endures humiliation from her family. She was walking down the street and thought about making a sweet dessert tomorrow to somehow cheer up her lady. Suddenly, her eyes caught on something shiny. Mary looked more closely and saw that there was a gold coin lying on the ground next to the curb. The girl picked it up, not believing her eyes. She twirled it in her hands and said uncertainly, "Is this coin really gold?" She was both pleased and surprised at the same time, not believing her luck. But eventually she did become convinced that it was indeed a gold coin. Suddenly she remembered Lady Letitia's words and her wish that Mary should find the money. The incredible hunch stunned the girl and she thought that it was a coincidence, wasn't it? Or could it be the same magical powers? Those were her memories. Letitia sat in the shade of a spreading tree and watched a young boy practicing his swordsmanship, and he said with fervor that he would definitely become an imperial knight, and she smilingly said that she would cheer for him because he was her fiancé. On the day of the competition, she gathered herself and thought that she hoped he would pass the imperial court's knight exam, and she, as his fiancé, should support him. She turned to Mary and asked her to hand her a handkerchief, but Mary did not seem to hear her. The girl kept thinking about the gold coin she had found on her way home yesterday. She couldn't stop thinking about whether it was a coincidence or not. And when Letitia repeated her name several times and asked what it was she was thinking about, Mary confusedly replied that she had just gone into her mind for a while, and she hastily complied with Letitia's request and handed her a handkerchief, asking if she needed anything else. But Letitia thanked her and said she needed nothing more. She walked towards the castle exit but met her sister Diana in the lobby. She looked as irresistible as ever, and as always she was extremely cold. Diana asked her that Letitia seemed to be going somewhere, and the girl told her that she was going to see her brother Levion. But Diana suddenly became angry and asked angrily why she should go to him. Such unconcealed aggression struck Letitia, and she asked that it was strange to go to support him. Diana, still also gloatingly looking at Letitia, caustically said what support meant, and without another word she walked past the embarrassed Letitia without giving her any explanation for her behavior. And the girl thought, what's the matter with her? She got into the carriage and traveled to the jousting ground. And the whole time she was traveling, she kept thinking that Diana was strange, until the coachman told her that they had arrived. He helped her out of the carriage and drove off to make room for the new carriages to arrive. And Laetitia looked around in confusion trying to find her brother Levian. And when she finally found him, she gasped at how amazing he looked. He was wearing an Imperial Knight's camisole, and it emphasized his manly appearance. Laetitia smiled looking at him, and he asked what she was doing here, and the girl replied that she had come to cheer him up. But Levian looked at her tensely somehow and said surlily that she shouldn't have come. This was a surprise to Laetitia, and she said confusedly that she was sorry it was burdensome for him, and added that she would leave now. But Levian turned round and walked away, and Laetitia, asking him to wait, followed him. She remembered the shawl she had made for her brother. She wasn't sure, but she would be glad if he accepted it. Still, she dared to hand it to him, saying that she wanted to give him a present. Levian stopped and without turning to Laetitia said one word: ability. Although the meaning of the word was clear to her, she couldn't help but wonder what he was trying to say. He turned round and asked grudgingly that she had not yet awakened her powers. Laetitia had not expected such anger. Would he too reproach her with powers that had not awakened? She clutched the fabric of her dress with her hands and begged desperately that he would forgive her. He carelessly snatched the handkerchief from her hands and said dismissively that she seemed to have a lot of extra time on her hands doing something like that. Laetitia was oppressed by his words. They hurt her tender heart. She had tried to please him and wanted to support him sincerely before the fight, but it turned out that he only wanted her abilities, and she as a person did not interest him at all. He said he was leaving, and Laetitia looked up at him in surprise. What should she do now, stay or go home? He turned his head and asked if there was any reason why he should stay with her for a while longer. The girl was completely shattered by his words and did not know what to say to him. The girl was completely broken by his words and did not know what to say to him. She remembered how, not so long ago, he had been happy to spend time in her company. His eyes shone with joy and he was cheerful. She stood with her eyes down and thought, how could this be? The bitterness of this conversation filled her soul. Laetitia did not notice the man walking towards her, and the next moment she collided with him, losing her balance. But the young man picked her up without letting her fall. She raised her head and started apologizing for not looking where she was going. A tall, handsome guy was looking at her, with beautiful dark blue eyes, worriedly. There was worry in his blue eyes. Laetitia looked at the hand he was holding and noticed the blood on it. The young man asked if she was all right. She rushed to assure him that she was fine and noticed that he had hurt himself. But the young man pronounced he was fine and added that he was glad she wasn't bruised. And saying that he must go, he turned round and walked away, while Laetitia stood thinking feverishly that he had hurt himself and must be helped. She exclaimed for him to wait, and the young man turned at her call. Laetitia handed him the handkerchief that Levian had rejected, and said that if he didn't mind he could use it to put on his wound. Although it was only a small handkerchief, he was a little surprised and hesitated, but he took the handkerchief and thanked her for her concern and put it in his inner pocket. But seeing the protest on her face, he asked what was wrong, and Laetitia explained that she had given him a handkerchief to wipe away the blood. But he hesitated, saying, wouldn't that be an insult? I mean, it would stain him, that handkerchief. It's Mrs. Precious' handkerchief, isn't it? Laetitia was struck by his remark that the handkerchief was precious. It was so unfamiliar to her that her care was precious to someone. It made her happy and she smiled, embarrassed by this new sense of caring and warmth that the people closest to her had not shown her. Meanwhile, he held out a handkerchief to her and pronounced that she could take it. But Laetitia took his hand and put it to his wounded arm, and the young man pronounced that he was now soiled. But Laetitia said, embarrassed, that it was all right, and she added that he didn't need to return it. She finished tying his arm in a neat knot and saying that was better. She let go of his arm. He stared at her work in amazement and asked if he could get her name. Laetitia was pleased to be with this polite and sensitive young man because she had not been rejected or ignored in a long time. She smiled happily and said that her name was Laetitia Leroy. The man fell to the ground and covered his face with his hands, making it clear that he was defenseless and not ready to fight. His opponent was defeated and he towered over him holding a sword in his hand. The crowd in the stands murmured that it was impossible not to recognize his mastery of the sword. Quickly, he put his opponent down. The people who watched the duel discussed the winner, saying that he was like a duke. But someone argued that he was only formally a duke who had not gone through the succession ceremony. He had heard people say about him that it was hard to call him a duke if he didn't go through the succession ceremony. And even if he wanted to have a ceremony, he couldn't. His family has no money right now. What's the point of his abilities if he's poor? They continued to judge, saying that the first time he took the exam, the Duchess died. The second time, the loan sharks came and made a scandal. How would he fail next time? This gossip was unpleasant enough for the young duke, and he thought, why don't they swing the sword again if they have time to make such a useless wager? A couple of days ago, that's exactly what he was thinking. Was he really that unlucky? How tired he was of it. He clenched his fist thinking about how pathetic he was. And that emotion didn't give him pleasure. It only made him more irritated. He was leaving the battle arena in such an irritated and depressed state that he failed to react in time and ran into a pensive Laetitia. She was as sweet and beautiful as a spring flower. She apologized straight away, even though it wasn't her fault. His irritation vanished at once. It gave way to surprise and fascination. And then she also offered him a handkerchief to treat his wounds. Did she really make it herself? Then she took care of him and bandaged his wounded arm. She was so kind to him, and he was a complete stranger to her, and had almost knocked her down. He learnt that her name was Letitia Leroy, and there was something unusual about this girl. He looked at his carefully rewound hand and thought that he wasn't so unlucky today. The image of this sweet and kind girl came before his eyes again. Her smile warmed the world around her, and he thought with certainty that today he was sure to be lucky. Letitia Leroy, like a good angel, was a wonderful omen. The sword fell out of his opponent's hands and hit the ground with a clang. This was the site of the night's examination. It was announced that Enoch Achilles had won. Enoch Achilles has passed the 458th night exam. Yes, it was him, Duke Enoch Achilles, and it was his victory brought to him by a girl with an angelic face. From the bleachers came the surprised cheers that he had won even with an injured arm. Someone asked what was wrong with this puppy. It wasn't until evening that Letitia returned home, after a day filled with various vicissitudes. She was greeted with a cheerful smile by Mary, and she immediately noticed the blood on the young lady's hands. Mary asked how she had managed to hurt herself, and then she added that she should have been more careful. But Letitia was quick to say that it wasn't her blood, and the good maid exhaled and said with relief that she had been frightened and thought it was her blood, and then she offered to wash her handkerchief. But Letitia hesitated, and a slight color of embarrassment covered her face, and she said she had given it to someone who needed it more. Mary said, was it not a handkerchief dear to her heart? And Letitia comforted her by saying that she had another. And then Mary certainly relaxed. When Letitia was about to leave, she suddenly said that she had to take care of Diana's present in advance, and she asked the girl what she wanted to prepare. Letitia asked her in a cocky way what she was curious about, and when Mary answered in the affirmative, she said with a sly squint that it was a secret. But here comes this day of Diana's birthday party. There were many guests gathered in their house. Everyone congratulated her on her name day and wished her a happy birthday. And Diana thanked everyone, saying they were the reason she had the happiest birthday ever. Amongst all this crowd was Letitia. She walked round the hall looking for her sister to wish her a happy birthday and give her a present. She saw her among a group of girls and called out to her. Letitia was glowing with joy as always, but on hearing her voice, Diana's face became annoyed and she asked what was the matter. But still, with propriety, she turned to her sister, and Letitia said she wished her a happy birthday. And Diana, hiding her displeasure behind her fan, thanked her. Letitia held out a white box and pronounced that it was her birthday present that she had prepared for her, and she said why shouldn't she open it? And the ladies standing nearby picked up on this suggestion, saying that they too would be interested to see what was in there. Diana opened the box, and in it on a cushion lay a brooch with emeralds framed in gold and decorated with a green ribbon. Some of the guests gasped and asked if Letitia had chosen the gift herself, but one of the girls, standing very close unceremoniously, said that it seems that such a thing was popular 10 years ago, and then, to make up for her tactlessness, added that still the brooch is beautiful in its own way. But that remark had already spoilt Diana's mood, though she tried hard not to show it. He slammed the jewelry box shut, and the lady standing next to her said that if she had known this would happen, she would have prepared a different present. And Diana asked her what she meant. And the lady said that she remembered how Diana had complimented her brooch last year, saying that it was very beautiful. And I gave her a brooch as a gift too, but Diana's reaction was quite different. She began to praise the gift, saying she had never seen such beauty before, and how it could be so detailed. It's just beautiful. And she immediately pinned it on her dress, thanking the lady for such a gift and promising to keep it safe. Diana glanced at Letitia, who was standing next to her with a sad expression on her face. She was hurt that her gift had gone unappreciated. Diana smiled at the guests and said that she would like to take the presents to the room with her sister, if they didn't mind, and she wished everyone a good time. And he and Letitia, under the gaze of the crowd, went on their way out of the hall. Letitia glanced at Diana, but she showed no emotion until they left the hall. And as soon as the door closed behind them and no outsiders could see them, she immediately looked angrily at her sister and pronounced that next time that she should not give her anything, and unceremoniously thrust the box with the brooch into Letitia's hands. But that was not the end of her angry tirade. She continued, hissing that who had asked her to prepare anything. But Letitia said dejectedly that it was her birthday, and she wanted to give her a present. But Diana's anger was unstoppable, and she shouted that in that case she could have given her something else. Who would wear something like that in their day? And she added that it was tasteless, and then declared that next time she shouldn't come to her birthday party at all. This statement stunned Letitia, and she said indignantly that she was her older sister. Her family. How could she not wish her a happy birthday? Diana smirked and asked with a sneer, family? And after a moment's thought, she added, wasn't she embarrassing her family enough already? Letitia asked her in bewilderment what it all meant, and Diana asked what she was asking because she really didn't know. She went on to say that if she didn't have powers, she should at least be sensible. She wanted to fall through the ground today after her gift. And she summarized that Laetitia was pitiful to look at. And then she corrected herself and said she was ashamed. Letizia was saddened by Diana's words. After all, she had been thinking about this brooch for months, and her sister was ashamed of her and her gift. She was so sad and hurt. The guests kept arriving, and one of them said hello to the Marquis of Leroy. He said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. It was Mr. Sejos, the local priest. Marquis Leroy was glad to see such a guest. He had often sought his advice in times of need, and so he thanked him for taking the time to visit them. Mr. Sejos said that it was the birthday of the Marquis's precious daughter, so how could he not come? And the Marquis, seeing Diana's silhouette, asked permission to introduce his daughter to him. And when Diana smiling radiantly approached them, he proudly said that this was his second daughter, Diana. And the girl said that she was glad to welcome Mr. Sejos. And then he turned to Letitia, who was following Diana, and sullenly told her to say hello too. The girl bowed her head and said hello, saying that she was Letitia Leroy. And then apologizing that she wasn't feeling well, she asked if she could leave them first. The Marquis was not happy. The Marquis was unhappy. He took the opportunity to reproach her for not even being able to celebrate her sister's birthday properly. The girl, bowing her head, listened silently to this tirade in her own direction. Her unhappy look did not escape the priest. Apparently she was not well. Diana also asked permission to leave. She wanted to enjoy her birthday a little more, and he graciously allowed it. The two girls left, and the men remained in conversation. The Marquis told the priest something, and the priest looked inquiringly at Laetitia's departing face. Then he said that Marquis Leroy seemed to care a lot about his second daughter, and the Marquis replied that, whatever it was, this child had saved their family. And he continued his thought by saying that compared to her Letitia, but the priest interrupted him and asked what was wrong with this child. And the Marquis replied that she was upsetting him because her powers had not yet awakened. And the priest, rubbing his beard, remarked that it was very strange. The Leroy family has long been a prominent family, in various areas of, and he repeated that Letitia had not yet awakened her powers, and he said that he would have to talk to this child later. It was a long time ago. Letitia's mum was pregnant at the last term. The new business had failed, and now the Marquise Leroy was in financial difficulty. But worse, after the Marquise gave birth to Letitia, she was diagnosed with infertility. But at some point, business began to flourish. There were new favorable contracts and deals, and the Marquise was able to regain her health. And the Leroy family was successfully able to recover. The Marquis and Marquess had questions. When did things start going so well? And they decided it started the moment this baby was born. Diana. They thought she brought prosperity to their family. And the Marquis never tired of saying how lucky they were to have Diana, and he would always be grateful to God for her birth. The priest listened to him sipping his tea and asked about the abilities his second daughter had developed. And the Marquis said it was the rain of flowers. The priest didn't even understand at once, so he asked her what her ability was. And the Marquise explained that it was a rain of flowers, a truly colorful and breathtaking sight. The priest concluded that he was very fond of his second daughter, and said in a low voice that he found his elder daughter kind and very sweet. But the Marquis sullenly said, "What good is that? She has no powers. She is a disgrace to the family." But Mr. Sejos urged him not to be so strict, for she was his child after all. Marquis Leroy pronounced that he was acting calmly at first. Ability or not, she was still his child. But as time went on, he began to worry that Letitia's engagement would not look good in the eyes of the public. And Mr. Sejos asked him if he was going to break her engagement, but the Marquis said he wouldn't call it an annulment, just that Diana would be the bride instead of Letitia. But this already angered the priest, and he said, so that the Marquis would not be a fool, what if Letitia does have powers? And he added that Barter Leroy should not believe only what was in front of him, but look wider. He said he came here after a long absence, and so it would be a pity to stay here. He intended to take a walk round the grounds, and the Marquis offered to take him. But Mr. Sejos wanted to be alone with himself and think over what he had heard, so he said that it was not the first time he had come here. And he would look around himself. Marquis Barter Leroy was also left alone to think. He remembered how hard it had been for them when their first daughter was born. They had just chosen a name for her, deciding that her name would be Letitia. Immediately, a few days later, the Marquise, who was nursing Letitia, said that a letter had arrived reminding her of her debt, and he thought again that it was a good thing Diana had been born safely. In fact, a few days after that, they received a letter notifying them that an important partner would finally sign off on their family. From then on, their life was good, and he was very fond of his second daughter. Remembering all this, the Marquis decided that he would soon have to speak to the Marquis of Els, to break his engagement to Letitia and betroth the young lord to Diana. That was his plan, and he didn't drag this conversation out. A few days after Diana's birthday party, when the whole family gathered for dinner, he asked her how her day had gone today. Diane said, smiling contentedly as she chatted with Brother Levian over a cup of tea today. This astonished Letitia. for she did not know that he had come to visit them, but she remained silent and did not ask any questions. Marquis Leroy clarified what was wrong with the Marquis of Elam, and Diana answered in the affirmative, adding that he had given her a present, saying that he regretted not being able to come to her birthday party. And she lifted her hand up, fixing her hair and showing the bracelet that adorned her wrist, and she asked her father if he thought it was beautiful. Her father said it looked very nice on her, and then she said she was going to wear it for a while. Letitia thought that Levian had come to give a present to Diana and had not even looked at her, his fiancée. The conversation at the table continued as usual. Father asked how Emile was doing, and Letitia was absorbed in her own thoughts, thinking about why he hadn't come to her birthday party, and she thought that if she asked about it, it would be strange. The conversation continued. Father asked Irene how she was doing at the Magic Academy, but Letitia realized that she could not stay here any longer, and so rising from her seat she asked permission to leave first, citing fatigue. And her father looked at her unhappily and did not detain her, allowing her to leave. When Letitia left the dining room, her father turned to Diana again, asking her what she thought of the young lord. Diana looked up at him and asked if he was talking about Brother Levian. And her father didn't beat around the bush and asked her directly what she thought of him as a marriage partner. Tension hung in the dining room. Xavier and Emile stopped eating and looked at their father in surprise. Even the smallest of the family, Irene, opened her mouth in surprise, for Brother Levian was Letitia's fiancé. But her father said, as if nothing had happened, that he was going to speak to the Marquise about canceling the engagement between Letitia and the young lord, and to propose to him an engagement to Diana. And he asked what she would say to that. To say that Diana was delighted was to say nothing. She couldn't believe her good fortune, for she had liked Levian for a long time. The next day, Letitia was walking out of the mansion, absorbed in her thoughts. Some uneasy forebodings kept her in a state of uneasiness. Suddenly she was called. It was Diana. She asked where Letitia was going, and the older sister replied that she had an appointment with her brother Levian. That made Diana laugh. Letitia asked her why she was laughing, and again some oppressive, strange feeling squeezed her breast. And at that moment, Diana leaned closer to her and said that she just felt sorry for her sister, but the face expressed gloating. Letitia looked puzzled, trying to understand what was behind Diana's behavior, but she said it was a joke and she shouldn't make such an expression. And lastly, she wished her a good time. But Letitia felt the darkness thickening around her. She could not understand why. She arrived at the L family's estate, but she wondered what Diana meant when she said she felt sorry for her. In the end, she decided not to get too worked up. She was about to meet her fiancé. She pushed open the living room door with her hand and walked inside. Levian was sitting on the armchair, drinking tea. When he saw Letitia, he said that they had not seen each other for a long time, but there was no enthusiasm in his words. He did not even stand up to meet her, and Letitia smiled casually and asked politely how he was doing. But Levian replied a little irritably, as he always did, not really bothering to talk much. Letitia asked him why, when he came to visit them, he only saw Diana. Her face became sad, and she added that it made her a little sad because she wanted to see him too. But she decided not to burden him with her frustrated feelings and smiled again and asked how his training was going. Wasn't it hard for him? But apparently Levian was not particularly disposed to socializing, for to her polite question he replied reproachfully that she was as unconcerned as ever. This aroused Letitia's surprise. And then he asked what did she even know about what was going on in the family now, and blurted out that their families were now discussing the cancellation of their engagement to her. Letitia exclaimed with surprise. She could not believe what he was saying. She clutched the fabric of her skirt with her hands to hold back her emotions. All she could say was, "Is it really true?" And Levian said coldly that if she had nothing more to say, she could go home. It was rude of him. She looked at him with wide-open eyes, trying to understand what he was really feeling. Then she asked him if he was okay with that decision. But Levian bowed his head and remained silent. He was aloof and cold, which said it all by itself that he agreed. Letitia remembered how in the past she had supported him during training and told him not to get upset, and that he would do well next time. He smiled at her and thanked her for her support, saying that her presence calmed him down. Calling her by her name, Letitia Leroy, he rose from his seat and said that they were no longer of an age to play childish games, and that she should mean it. His rudeness and tactlessness deeply hurt the girl, and tears flowed from her eyes, but she still asked him how she should understand it. He stepped round her and without looking at her said what he meant to say, that it would be better for them to part. He went out slamming the door, and Letitia stood unable to comprehend all that had now come upon her. She remembered Sister Diana's gloating expression and her words, and now all the things she had refused to accept fell into place in an instant. Tears sprang from her eyes. Everyone had betrayed her. Levian too, she was the only one who knew nothing. She was the only one who hadn't been initiated. She rode in the carriage, coming back home with a heavy weight on her heart. She kept thinking, since when? When had it started? And why was she the only one in the dark? She had been neglected by everyone, including those closest to her, her family. If the cancellation of the engagement was really, truly, but she refused to believe it, deciding it wasn't certain yet. Suddenly, she had an idea and knocked on the stable boy's door, asking him to go to the square first. She had decided to buy something, and he readily agreed to take her. So Letizia decided to pretend she didn't know anything. Soon the charioteer informed her that he had arrived. She thanked him and got out of the carriage. The servant asked worriedly if she would be all right. After all, she was without a maid, but Letitia assured him it was nothing. The children rushed past her as she frolicked. She walked along the square where the market was located and looked around. She thought that she had often come here with her brothers when she was little. Suddenly, she saw a kiosk with a sign saying, "Try your luck." The caller was trying so hard to attract people that he was shouting in all directions that if anyone hit this target, he would get a sack of flour. And Letitia was surprised to think that she had often played this game before, and it gave her a lot of pleasure. Someone shouted near her, and she heard someone urging her brother to play the game, because you could win a whole sack of flour. She listened to the conversation. The girl asked if her brother had a coin, but he categorically replied that it was a common trick, and suggested that they go home. Letitia cautiously approached them and pronounced that if they did not mind, she would give a coin. The man turned to the lady who had spoken and said in surprise, "Is it really her? Letitia Leroy?" The girl who had previously asked for a coin squealed with delight that could it really be possible. She took the coin from Letitia and thanked her and called her brother to hurry up and do it, before her elder brother changed his mind, and he only called her name warningly. He was uncomfortable with the situation, and he apologized for his family's behavior, saying that his youngest children were obnoxious. But Letitia laughed and said that on the contrary, wasn't it nice to see them so active? She looked at the young people talking excitedly and said that she thought they were brother and sister. And the Duke confirmed it by specifying that they were twins. Letitia looked at them and pronounced that they all seemed to be getting along quite well together. He looked at her studiedly. There was something special about her tone, and he said that on second thought he was a little late with his greetings. And leaning towards Letitia, he asked permission to formally introduce himself. Duke Enoch Aquilus. Letitia looked at him as if mesmerized. His dark blue eyes seemed to look into her soul. His easy, friendly smile gave him a special charm. The pause lingered while she scrutinized him, but still Letitia called out her name in response. And he said with a big smile that he remembered her from the day they first met. She shifted her gaze to the twins, who were preparing to try their luck. And the Duke said, "Why shouldn't she try it herself?" But Letitia replied that she was always unlucky, but then smilingly pronounced that the people around her are good at this sort of thing, and added that it makes her happy. And at that moment there were shouts of joy from the twins, Liel and Ian. They seemed to be rejoicing over their winnings. And indeed, Liel exclaimed that they had won a sack of flour. Letitia and Enoch stared in amazement at the joyous twins, and Letitia said that she had not expected his brother and sister to be among such fortunate people. She looked up at him and smiled ingratiatingly, and Enoch uttered what was truly astonishing. And then Liel walked up to them and pronounced that they had completely forgotten about manners and hadn't even introduced themselves, and she sat down in a curtsy saying her name was Liel Achilles. Enoch's brother wanted to give his name as well, but Liel beat him to it by saying that it was her spoilt twin brother Ian Achilles. Letitia replied that she was pleased to meet Lady Liel and Lord Ian and told them her name. Liel looked at her with such surprise that Letitia thought something was wrong, but the next second she was already between her and Enoch, and she took them under her arms and said that it was fate, and suggested that they all have fun together. Enoch shouldered the sack of flour he had won and they walked on through the fairgrounds, looking for more entertainment. Letitia had so much fun with Liel. Enoch's sister was a very cheerful girl, and Letitia forgot all her troubles and burdens in her presence. And when the time came for her to part, she said enthusiastically that she had had a lot of fun today, and called Letitia her sister. Then she invited her to come to their mansion next time, and promised to bake a cake for her. But Jan didn't stay away and encouraged his sister by saying that Letitia would be poisoned if she ate what Liel had cooked. And narcissistically, he said he would cook it himself. But Liel did not let herself be offended, and threw herself at him with fists and said angrily that he was not the one to interfere with her. Enoch said that if Letitia felt pressurized, but she hastened to assure him that it was not burdensome at all and blushed with embarrassment. And Enoch said smilingly that they would look forward to seeing her then. There was so much kindness in his words, and it had been so long since she had been told such words, that her heart trembled with such warmth. The carriage was taking her home. The moon shone brightly in the night sky, illuminating the whole neighborhood. Letitia thought it had been a long time since she'd had such a good time, and it was so much like a real family. She remembered that they used to bake biscuits, too. Yes, there was such a time. Her brothers and sisters welcomed her with joy rather than shunned and chastised her. Diana's eyes shone with love for her. How long ago it had been when she had felt needed and wanted in her family. Letitia looked at the glowing moon and thought that she wished she too had a family as friendly as Duke Achilles. She stood in front of her house and reality weighed heavily on her shoulders. What was she thinking? Her family is here. The next day, Marquis Leroy, talking to Laetitia, asked that he had heard that she had become close to the family of the Duke of Aquilus, and he asked why she had become involved with such an unlucky family. And without waiting for an answer, he mouthed that she should henceforth make sure that nothing so useless reached his ears. Laetitia was surprised and wanted to say something to him, but the Marquis rudely interrupted her, not wanting to listen. He said that if she could do nothing to help her family, she should at least not cause trouble. And then he said that unhappiness was contagious. Laetitia remembered the Duke's cheerful face. It was always cheerful, and the Duke was courteous and friendly. He had told her that he would be glad to see her at any time. He was so handsome and attractive and a real gentleman. And Laetitia realized that she did not want to stop talking to him. On this day, Mr. Sejos was waiting for her to talk to him, so she went to see him. When she met him in the garden, she called out to the priest, and he smiled and asked her if she had arrived. He apologized for calling her so unexpectedly, and said he had something he wanted to talk to her about. The elder stood across from her, and when she asked what their conversation would be about, he said he wanted to talk about her abilities. This upset Laetitia, though she tried not to show it. Everyone around her kept telling her about her abilities, creating tension. She said the rumors, and then hesitated to suggest that perhaps he hadn't heard them, but the wise priest was not going to censure her as others had done. He said that if she simply closed her eyes, it would not mean that the world would cease to exist. And then he said that he was very old and it was hard for him to stand on his feet for a long time, and he suggested that we sit down and talk quietly first. As they sat down at the table, Laetitia pronounced that in truth, everyone already knew she had no powers. But Mr. Sejos said that maybe she would just blossom a little later, and he asked if she had ever felt something strange or incomprehensible happening around you. Laetitia thought about it and said that in fact things had happened. She had had bad luck. But she thought it was more than just bad luck. Mr. Sejos asked since when did she notice that? And she replied that she doesn't know exactly, but she thought it was since she became more conscious. But he pronounced that there were many different kinds of talented people in the Leroy family. Often there were abilities that were not very useful. Of course, in that era, even they were considered something useful. Depending on the time, people with such abilities are either the center of attention or ignored. And he said that if it was as she said, she shouldn't wake up, because maybe she's already awakened. Laetitia was amazed at his words. Had she awakened already? And what could she do? What is her power? She began to ask him to tell her, for it was so important to her. But Mr. Sejos said apologetically that he could not say that for sure, and he himself, looking at Letitia's reaction and her condition, thought that the general neglect of others had driven this child to such despair. One of the maids was watching their conversation carefully. She stood hidden behind a bush, trying to hear what was being said. But the distance was long enough that only scraps of phrases reached her. Ability, misfortune. She couldn't make sense of what she was hearing. When Laetitia got home, she went to the kitchen and decided to cook something. It helped her distract herself and think about whether she could really do something. If she really had powers? She stirred the dough in the bowl intensely and thought then, what was this neglect and discrimination she was facing so far? She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she could not hear what was going on around her. Mary called out to her more than once, and finally said that she couldn't be reached. And she said, warningly, that she shouldn't think too much, that the kitchen was a dangerous place. Laetitia apologized and Mary pronounced it was time to bake the biscuits in the oven, and she handed the tray of finished biscuits to Laetitia to put in the oven. They watched the biscuits baking and rejoiced that they had succeeded. When the biscuits were ready, Laetitia decorated them beautifully with figs, and Mary praised her, saying it was very good. Laetitia put the lid on the tray and said that she would take it to the boys and come and help Mary clean up. But Mary asked what about her. But Laetitia was in a hurry to give the biscuits to her brothers and sisters, and she could eat later. She was walking down the corridor and thought it seemed Diana had gone somewhere. Who should she take the biscuits to first? And she decided it would be Emil. When she walked into his office, she said hello and smiled. He was busy studying as always, writing something down neatly in his notebook. But he stopped what he was doing to ask her what she wanted. He didn't say hello, didn't smile back at her, just stared at her sullenly. And Laetitia gave him biscuits, saying she baked them because she remembered that they used to love such desserts. But Emil leaned over the sheet of paper again and said that he was a little busy at the moment. And then Laetitia said she was leaving and would not distract him. Irene was next. Laetitia remembered that she had loved sweets since childhood and should be happy about this surprise. She walked over to Irene and called out to her. The girl looked at her sister with big blue eyes and asked what was wrong. Laetitia said that she was on her way to her place and wanted to give her a biscuit. She added that they were her favorite fig biscuits. She also wanted to suggest to her little sister that, if she was okay with it, how about together? But the girl said she was sorry, but she did not like figs and biscuits. This was a surprise to Laetitia, for she remembered that Irene liked sweets. But the girl suddenly cried out that she had said she did not love. Did Laetitia not understand her, and she asked not to be disturbed anymore about such trifles. Letitia was saddened by this behavior of Irene's after all. She had genuinely shown concern and didn't deserve such neglect. In the meantime, the maid who had been eavesdropping on Mr. Sayos's conversation with Letitia met another maid who was gorging on something and decided to tell what she had learnt. But first she inquired what she was eating, and the girl said it was the biscuits Mr. Emile had given her, and she asked in reply what she had sniffed out. And the maid said she had heard Mr. Sayos and Lady Letitia talking about something, and she smiling gloatingly said that she didn't quite understand, but it was about the lady's awakened ability to bring misfortune. Letitia went out into the garden after giving her brother and sister biscuits. It was lovely sunny weather, and she was enjoying the warm sunshine. Suddenly she noticed a flock of pigeons on the ground below the castle windows. Letitia was surprised and wondered where they had come from. The birds seemed to be picking something from the ground. When the girl came closer and looked at what it was, she was upset, because the pigeons pecked the biscuits that she had so carefully prepared for her relatives, and they just threw it to the pigeons. In the meantime, the sensational news that Lady Letitia had awakened the ability to bring bad luck was spreading through the castle among the servants. The servants were talking about it by word of mouth. Some could not believe that the always amiable Letitia was capable of bringing misfortune, but others were convinced that Lady Diana could make it rain flowers, and one maid even said that the maid who served young Mr. Emile had fallen ill after eating a biscuit the lady had made, and a panic began to grow among the servants that just being near Lady Letitia could ruin their luck. Some of them were horrified, and they decided to avoid her from then on. Firstly, leaving all the work to Mary. Letitia, at this time in her upset feelings, decided to take a walk to think and put her feelings in order. She remembered again the times when there were good days she had spent with the boys, and she knew and felt their love. Except now they were shunning her, avoiding her, and showing their disrespect and disregard in every way possible. She came back from her thoughts and realized that she was standing in front of Duke Enoch's palace. Letitia stopped and wondered how she had come to be here, and what should she do now that she had come uninvited. But the twins Jan and Liel were watching her through the window, and she said that it was Sister Letitia and suggested that Ian go to meet her. And without waiting for Ian, she rushed towards the girl they had recently met and had so much fun with. She threw herself into Letitia's arms as she went along, saying that she was so glad to see her. And Letitia was shocked that a person she hardly knew was so happy to see her, and her family so neglected. But Liel didn't let her get a word in edgewise, genuinely happy that Letitia had come to their house to play with them, and she was so excited that Ian couldn't stand it and asked her to calm down already. Letitia smiled uncertainly as Liel said that she had missed her so much. She said that she had promised to come, and that she always kept her word. And Liel gustily said that was fine, and grabbing Letitia by the arm, commanded her to follow. Ian could barely keep up with them and asked indignantly where Liel had pulled Letitia, but she told him to talk less and follow them. She led the girl into the kitchen, which sparkled with unprecedented cleanliness. All the items were neatly stacked and the surfaces wiped clean. Liel sat Letitia down on a chair and told her to just sit there and watch her create a masterpiece. Letitia only asked in surprise that she was really going to cook it herself, but the girl turned to her and said to Letitia not to worry. She was sure she would enjoy it. But Jan said warningly that her brother had told her not to make a mess and to sit quietly. But Liel insisted that she couldn't make one pie, and Letitia watched and marveled at their cute bickering, and then she smiled and said that she really wanted to make one. And Ian agreed that his sister was very stubborn when she did something, and he told Letitia that if it was burdensome or uncomfortable for her, she could tell him. After all, his sister is a bit rough, but she's very sociable. This last phrase he said with pride. Letitia could see that Ian loved his sister in the tone of his voice and the expression on his face, and she liked that they were so friendly. She looked at how hard Liel was trying and uttered that to tell the truth. She was a little embarrassed, but she was glad, so much so that she is, on the contrary, grateful. She was so touched by their concern, and it had been so long since anyone had done anything for her. Ian smiled and said that if so, he was glad. He added that he was worried because she had a confused look on her face. Liel asked him to come up for a moment, and he asked her what was going on again and went to answer her call. Letitia watched them, and Liel said it would be boring to make an ordinary pie, but Jan said he had picked apples and she could use them. Letitia was so eager to join their circle, and she said that if they didn't mind, she would like to join them, adding that she was bored just sitting around doing nothing. Jan and Liel looked at each other and said uncertainly that she was their guest, but Letitia took the knife and apple and said she could peel them while Liel kneaded the dough. They chatted merrily, telling all sorts of funny stories while Liel rolled out the dough and laid out the filling. And when the pie was baked, they all gasped at how appetizing it looked. Ian didn't fail to support his sister, saying that it was because Mrs. Leroy had done most of the work, and Liel immediately jumped on him, saying that she was actually making the dough. At that moment, Duke Enoch Achilles appeared on the doorstep. He asked in surprise what they were doing here. The twins exclaimed at once, Letitia looked guiltily at Enoch, and he too noticed her, and the surprise on his face grew even greater. Letitia was embarrassed that she had come unannounced, and she said hello to the Duke with a guilty look. But he said with a smile that she had come to visit after all. He added that he had been waiting for her to come, and then he smiled happily and said he really wanted to see her again. His sincerity amazed the girl, and he also said that he had something to give back to her. But Letitia was embarrassed enough by what he had said that he wanted to see her, and the color of embarrassment flooded her face. Liel intervened in their conversation and said that they had made apple pie and offered to taste it. She added that he should eat faster, for she and Letitia had worked hard to make it delicious. But Jan interjected that Miss Leroy could be said to have made it, for which he was promptly slapped by his sister and told to shut up. As the twins squabbled and Enoch tried to calm them down, Letitia was suddenly afraid. What if the Duke didn't like the cake? She remembered how rudely Irene had answered her that she didn't like it, how she had shouted at her for not realizing she didn't like it, and how much hatred and aggression had been in her tone. She came over with a tray of pie and said that he didn't need to force himself to eat. Letitia smiled, but it looked strained. The Duke took the plate with the pie in his hands and thought about it. He could see that the girl was nervous. He smiled back at her and pronounced that no, they had worked so hard to cook it, so he just had to eat it. He poked a slice and sent it into his mouth. Letitia prayed that he would tell her that the pie was good, that he liked it. She couldn't stand the suspense and asked herself how his pie was. And the Duke pronounced it just delicious and asked for another piece. Letitia did not seem to hear his words. She stared at him open-mouthed, as if the meaning of his words had not reached her. The picture of discarded biscuits pecked by pigeons came to mind. Tears came to her eyes. Her tears came to her eyes. The long-contained emotions were coming out and she couldn't hold them back. Enoch said her name confusedly, and she apologized. She covered her face with her hands, trying to hold back tears of resentment. She said she wasn't going to cry, just worried about whether he'd like the cake. Enoch came to her to support her and said that he had never tasted such a delicious pie before, and he invited her to eat with him. He took her face in his hands and, wiping her tears, said that he could not eat if she cried. But his caring touch and affectionate tone made her cry even harder. She wished she could tell him not to say those words that hurt her soul. Liel saw Letitia crying and rushed over to them. She asked what Enoch had said to Miss Leroy that had made her cry, but he said confusedly that he had only said that the cake was delicious, and that was all. Letitia meanwhile calmed down and said that Mr. Achilles had done nothing wrong. She herself suddenly cried. And Liel asked why. Had something happened to her? Letitia nervously clenched her fingers, wondering if she could share with them and tell them everything. She wanted so badly for someone to just listen to her, and she ventured to say that for some reason she felt calmer around them. And her family. They hate her. She clasped her hands in front of her, the tension gripping her again, and Duke Achilles and Liel stood staring at her in amazement. How could such a bright and friendly person be hated? And then there were her own people, her family. Duke Enoch bowed to her on his knee and pronounced that she would always be welcome by them. And he asked her if she'd come more often, right? And he promised that then he would cook something delicious himself. Enoch smiled and asked her not to cry anymore. Letitia thanked him for his kindness and went home. Jan watched through the window as the carriage with Letitia drove out of their mansion and pronounced that she seemed like a nice person. Duke Enoch Achilles replied thoughtfully that he thought so too. A slight smile touched his lips at the memory of the girl. He remembered her sky-blue eyes that glowed with kindness, a cheerful disposition and a friendly smile. Something tender and warm settled in his heart and flared up every time he remembered this girl. His eyes kept her image from the day he'd met her. Ian, meanwhile, reminded him that he wanted to give her something back, didn't he? But Enoch replied that he would give it back next time. Letitia returned home and walked down the corridor full of good memories of Duke Achilles' family. They really are good people, she thought. Suddenly, she heard a stern tone and a question about where she had traveled to. This did not bode well, but meant that she was back in the house where she was superfluous. She looked in the direction from which the voice had come and saw her father. He looked stern and disdainful. Letitia stammered, needing to explain herself. But her father shouted irritably, what the hell was she doing there? He'd warned her, hadn't he? He'd told her not to get involved with that unfortunate Achilles family, and he mouthed that this was the last of his warnings. Letitia stood listening to his angry tirade in silence. A longing and deep sadness settled in her heart. He called her Letitia Leroy, and told her that if he heard one more time that she was spending time with this family, she should be prepared to stop being a part of their family. The conversation was over. No one was interested in her opinion. He was ready to kick her out the door. She wanted to say something, put out her hand to stop him, but she never said a word. Only one thought was running through her mind about why her father was so cold-blooded toward her. She walked up to her room and grabbed the handle. It would only be a moment before she was in her own little world. But on opening the door of the room, she saw that Diana was in it. This came as a complete surprise to Letitia. Her sister had not come to see her for a long time, and even in her absence. Letitia asked in surprise what she was doing in her room. Diana glared coldly at her sister. She turned away and said that just because the room was hers didn't mean she couldn't come here. Letitia asked her if she had anything more to say. Diana fixed her hair and said haughtily, "Of course." She said that Letitia had been getting on her nerves lately, talking to strange people. Letitia repeated the phrase "with strange people" in surprise. But Diana threw her an irritated look, so she didn't pretend not to understand. Letitia asked, startled, if she was talking about the Achilles family. Diana interjected that she had a hearing problem. Letitia's nerves were on edge and she shouted her sister's name angrily, but she interrupted her and also asked indignantly why she was bothering with people who had no money, no luck, and could do nothing. Letitia demanded that she dare not talk about them like that, but Diana in turn demanded that she stop talking to them. And she crossed her arms across her chest and said that rumors had spread everywhere. The Marquis of Leroy's first daughter, Letitia Leroy, is dragged everywhere with the cursed Duke Achilles. This came as a complete surprise to Letitia. She was taken aback by such a statement. And a furious Diana screamed that she at least realized how much their family's reputation was crumbling just because of her alone. And she screamed that he was using her. A sadness shadowed Letitia's face. No one understood her here, and she said that Diana could ignore her, Letitia, but that she should not dare to speak ill of people she did not know at all. But Diana deliberately covered her mouth with the palm of her hand and mockingly asked, "Why not?" And then Letitia said in a threatening tone that these people were better than them, who were throwing away what Letitia was doing for them. And then Diana laughed in her face, saying that's what this was all about. She said she'd heard that Letitia had made biscuits for Emile and Irene, and said just as mockingly that she wouldn't have eaten those either, to be honest. She made a serious expression on her face and asked how could she eat what Letitia had cooked without knowing what she had put in it. It was outright mockery. Letitia asked in astonishment, "What did she say?" But Diana asked grudgingly, what was that look on her face? Did she really think they would take it and say thank you and happily eat the biscuits? And she laughed in her face again. Oh, I guess she did, and she said that she was sorry for Letitia then. And then she added that in any case, if she ever heard again that Letitia had met again with the Achilles family, she would tell her father at once. Letitia could say nothing. In this family, she was not only ignored and neglected, she seemed not even to be considered a human being. Her family was made up of cruel and indifferent people. Diana turned round and went to the door, but on the threshold she turned round and said that if Letitia didn't want to be kicked out, she should be sensible. When the door closed behind her, Letitia sank to the floor. She wanted to scream. Her chest felt like a vice. She wanted to cry, but her eyes were dry. Why were these people so cruel to her? She hadn't done anything wrong. Several days passed. Mary came to her room in the morning as usual to wake her up. She said she needed something to eat. After all, Letitia had hardly eaten anything for days, and she added that if she continued like this, she would faint. But Letitia continued to lie still, and only said apologetically that she had no appetite at all. But Mary said that on second thoughts, the entrance exam was just around the corner. And this phrase made Letitia rise. She asked Mary what exam she was talking about, and Mary replied that she was talking about the knight's entrance exams. Letitia picked herself up and pronounced that the exam was already so soon. She got up and opened a drawer of the chest of drawers and took out a box. Mary looked at its contents with interest and asked curiously what it was. Letitia took a gold bracelet out of the box and said that she had made it some time ago. And Mary said that it was a very beautiful bracelet made of gold thread. Letitia took it in her hand, and looking at it said that she had heard that it was good to give something like that to someone who was about to do something important. And she asked rather to herself, should she give this bracelet to him? Mary clenched her fists and said excitedly that of course she should. He was her fiancé. At these words, Letitia remembered the betrayal of her family and her fiancé, and her chest tightened again with resentment. But Mary, not noticing her lady's condition, said that why not take a walk in the garden today? Many of her favorite flowers were already in bloom, and Letitia agreed that it was right that she should take a walk now. She pulled herself together and stepped outside. Her blue eyes stood out brightly against her pale skin. She met Xavier in the alley that ran around the castle, and she called out to him, smiling to say hello. But he froze and stared at her with his eyes wide open. It was as if he had seen a ghost. And when Letitia asked him how his studies were progressing and if he was having a hard time, he was ready to run away. And telling her that he was very busy at the moment, he turned and ran away. Letitia stared at him in surprise, not understanding what caused his reaction. He looked at her with such frightened eyes, but Xavier was only the first person she'd seen today, and then there were the maids who scattered in different directions at her appearance. This made Letitia a little wary, but she could not understand what was going on. She felt that everyone was avoiding her, but she didn't know why. The next day she was drinking tea in the dining room and said that it smelt particularly nice today, and behind her stood Annie, shaking like an aspen leaf. Letitia asked if something was wrong and added that she had a strange look on her face, but Annie stammered that nothing had happened. And when Letitia looked at her again, she immediately said that she would be off for a moment. She had an errand to run which the Marquis had given her. She rushed out of the dining room with such speed that Letitia had no time to say a word. All she could think was that everyone was strange. When she met the maids in the corridor, they averted their eyes and tried to pass by as quickly as possible. This situation was beginning to annoy Letitia. She didn't understand why everyone avoided her. She met Irene in the corridor and called out to her. But the girl stopped and could not move. Her eyes were wide open and full of terror, as if she had seen a monster. Letitia came up and leaning towards her asked her what could she possibly know why the maids were avoiding her. But Irene was so scared that she shouted for Letitia to stay away from her. She even began to tremble with fear. Letitia looked at her sister perplexed. What had become of everyone? Had she become an outcast in this castle that everyone was shunning her? But Irene got really hysterical and kept screaming that she was afraid something bad would happen to her if she stood next to Letitia. Her older sister asked what she was talking about, and Irene said that how could she even walk around so calmly with such powers? But Letitia still didn't understand. And then Irene told her bluntly that everyone says that she, Letitia, has the ability to bring bad luck. After this sentence, Letitia took hold of her heart and asked what misfortunes were we talking about. She was so stunned by what Irene had said that it was hard for her to breathe. But Erin reprimanded her not to disturb others' lives anyway and stayed in her room. She turned and walked away from Letitia, and the latter said after Irene that she was only saying that she was less fortunate than others, but she never said that anything bad would happen if Irene was around her. But the girl said without turning round, "Is that so?" And she added boorishly that if he contacted her it would only bring her trouble. Letitia could not bear it, and she shouted her little sister's name. Annoyance choked her from the inside. At that moment Emile came out into the corridor where everything was going on and asked, "What's all the noise here?" Irene called out to him and immediately hid behind his back, showing that she was terrified. Letitia asked Emile if he had heard the rumors that had spread about her around the castle, that something bad only happens when she's around. And when he replied that he had heard, she asked annoyed that he really believed the rumors. But Emile assured her that of course he didn't, but asked her not to push Irene too hard. Letitia wanted to say something in her defense, but Emile said that Irene was frightened, and Letitia looked at her, hiding behind her brother's back, and really noticed her sister's eyes widened with fear. She could not believe that she was really afraid of her. And then Letitia apologized and pronounced that she had not meant to frighten her. And she saw Irene huddled into her older brother again, and he put his arm around her as if he wanted to protect her from everything in the world. Meanwhile, rumors continued to spread through the castle. There didn't seem to be a soul alive who wasn't gossiping about the First Lady's ability to bring bad luck, and that she was making everyone around her unhappy. People were afraid to approach her. They were careful not to be seen by Lady Letitia. Some wanted to tell Mr. Marquis, but others advised them not to interfere and to leave things as they were. So in addition to the neglect of her family, Letitia was also lonely. She sat in her room and wondered why everyone was treating her like this, because it was not her ability. One day there was a knock at the door of her room. It was Mr. Sayos. When he appeared on the threshold of her room, Letitia wondered why he was here. After all, everyone shunned her. But he said he wanted to talk to her, and asked if she minded.